Welcome to Mayo, washed in a rainbow of colours, tented by huge skies, blessed with a breathtaking Atlantic coast, and anchored by over 5,000 years of civilization. Again, welcome to Mayo. The county of Mayo on the west of Ireland, on the edge of Europe, boasts a stunningly beautiful and spoilt environment, and in a magical land that is always away from it all. Mayo's largely unspoilt, clean countryside, varying landscapes, unique scenery, and rich heritage and folklore mark it as the ideal tourist destination. Intimate towns positively burst with charm and personality, as welcoming as the Mayo people themselves. Folklore can be defined as the traditional beliefs, legends and customs current among the common people. Folklore has survived with unusual vigour in Ireland. This is partly because Ireland is an island on the periphery of Europe, partly because the country was never invaded by the Romans. It is also due in part to the great love of conversation, conviviality and storytelling among the people of Ireland. In former generations, the indigenous festivals of the Irish calendar, such as the beginning of spring, Christianised as St. Bridget's Day, May Eve, the Harvest Festival, the pattern observances of local saints, all have their own selections of amusement and preserved vestiges of early rituals. The Irish Folklore Commission was set up by the government in 1935 and down through the years has collected a vast amount of lore and ethnological data. The finest collection of folklore in Ireland is contained in the school's manuscript collection. This collection stems from the school scheme of 1937 to 1938, organised in 26 of the 32 counties of Ireland. The collecting scheme was carried out by children from 11 to 14 years of age in primary schools under the direction of their teachers, who followed specially prepared guidelines. The scheme resulted in large amounts of folklore material being collected, much of it from parts of the country not served by full-time or other collectors.
Way back in the 18th century, very few love matches were made. In fact, the bride-to-be may not have seen her groom until the wedding morning. How do you think of that?
We think nowadays of marriage as a kind of romantic liaison between two people, and it's hard for our young people, I think, nowadays to understand that not so long ago, even in their grandparents' times, romance didn't really enter into it before the marriage, whatever about after the marriage, and that marriage was really a kind of socio-economic liaison between people, so the two families would arrange that the son and the daughter would get married. Sometimes the daughter would be very lucky if she was consulted, so the marriage would be kind of set up.
A wedding was one of the great community occasions where a fine sense of neighbourliness was evident, with people rejoicing in each other's good fortune. In northwest County Mayo, at the end of the last century, straw boys were still very well known. They were disguised in tall conical masks, adorned with red and green stripes of cloth, and either white or red petticoats. Here, Mrs. Margaret Leonard, Glenfarne, County Leitrim, describes the wedding day in her area.
Next, the wedding day was fixed, and both families and friends met in the church on the wedding day. The couple was married and returned to the bride's house for breakfast, after which they went for a drive to the nearest town or village and spent the day there. They went by sidecar, no motors in those days, and if they were lucky, there were 2 or 3 sidecars and for the wedding party.
Sometimes the daughter would be very lucky if she was consulted, so the marriage would be kind of set up and a matchmaker would come and arrange it. The matchmaker, sometimes he was called a matchmaker, or a Blackfoot he was called in certain places. He'd come and he'd say, come into a girl's house and he'd say such and such a man was interested in marrying the daughter of the house, and then there would be kind of like a bargaining would go on. But by and large, you could say that in marriage, it was 2 families that were uniting. And there's a number of sayings about that. We say in Irish, Pos banas a glan agus posit to glan lig. If you marry a woman from the glen, you marry the whole glen. So that when you marry, it's a liaison between yourself and that whole community, if you like. Or pos fai banar a charnili agus fai cars Christi oadawala. And that means get a woman to marry in your own place, close to your own home, but you can get a godparent anywhere you like, far away. And the reason for that was when 2 families were linked by marriage like that, they would be, if you had turf to save or hay to cut or potatoes to dig, your in-laws then would be a great help to you, and they would lend you their horse or their donkey or their plough or whatever it was. So you needed to marry. There's no point in marrying, if you were up in Balmullet, there'd be no point in marrying a woman from Antrim, because her in-laws would be no use to you at all. Your in-laws would be no use. So it was really a socio-economic liaison, and there were lots of good things about that, I suppose, and lots of bad things and difficult things too. And the one thing was then, when this match would be made, the woman had to provide a dowry. And in Irish, the word for a dowry is spray. And this is funny saying, it's a funny saying, it's kind of black humour. And it says, the mo spregen cat is minnica fosi. If the cat had a dowry, she'd be off married. Because when the bargain was being made with the matchmaker, they'd be bargaining as to what she was worth and how much the father would give along with her. And I once heard an old woman saying, oh, when I got married, she said, you wouldn't get married unless your father was able to give your weight in gold with you. So people had to save up, and there would be funny stories that if a girl wasn't very beautiful physically, that they'd need even more dowry to get rid of her. But the dowry might be anything from, I heard one woman saying it was £20, a cow and a spinning wheel. And each daughter then, so people would be hoping that they had sons rather than daughters, because to get the daughters married they needed money, but the sons would bring in money to the family place. Another thing was, part of the dowry was the mother might give the newly married couple, the bride's mother might give them the bedding. So she might give them the stuff for the marital bed, you know, little things like that. So it was kind of like, and even after people were married, so in some parts of the country, in the traditional society, after the wedding feast was over, the bride and groom didn't go to live together for a month. The bride stayed with her parents and the groom went off to his parents. And I have a feeling, I've been trying to do some research on that, but I have a feeling that's something to do with the dowry as well. So the bride, the groom and bride didn't come together until the groom's parents were satisfied that the dowry had been paid in full or would be paid in full. No marriages took place during Lent, and in some parts of the country, the fortnight before Lent, a lot of people would get married in that fortnight before Lent, because they wouldn't be able to get married then for the whole of Lent. There's no such a thing nowadays, people can get married in Lent, but in the traditional times there was no such a thing as get married in Lent. And in some parts of the country, the first Sunday of Lent was called Chalk Sunday. And it was called Chalk Sunday because on that Sunday, anybody who hadn't, any of the old men or middle-aged men or younger men who hadn't succeeded in getting a marriage partner that year, the young people would go around and mark their suit with chalk at the Mass on the Sunday to indicate that they hadn't got a partner yet. and that shows us the importance of marriage. So if you were a man and you weren't married, you'd be trying to make sure you got yourself an arranged marriage or got yourself a wife or a partner before, so that this wouldn't happen to you. So it's a kind of a bit of humour, but at the same time it shows us that marriage was a very important thing. It was very important for people to be married, and for women it was very important to be married, because a single woman, a spinster, was in a very difficult position in society because she didn't have any home. When she got older, she was a burden on her own family. She didn't have any children to look after in her old age. If there was manual work to be done outside, she couldn't do it herself. She was depending on her neighbours. And even the Irish word for a widow is bantroach, and that actually means bantroach, and it means a ploughing woman. So a widow was a woman that had to do her own ploughing. So getting married then was a big serious thing and an important thing, and they had to have it done before Lent came. But other times for getting married, even the day you got married, Wednesday and Sunday were looked on as lucky days to get married, and Tuesday and Thursday were looked on as very unlucky days to get married. And also people didn't like to get married in the month of May for some reason. I haven't quite found out the reason, but all over the country they'll tell you, marry in May and you'll rue the day. So they didn't like to get married in the month of May. And another thing was, when they were getting married, there was lucky colours and unlucky. So they didn't like to wear the colour green. And it was green. It's really interesting because people think of green as the Irish national colour nowadays, and I think that comes from America really by and large, but it seems to be our lucky national colour. But actually in the traditional society, people didn't like the colour green. Green was supposed to be for grief, they said, and older people even yet wouldn't like to wear green clothes, or they wouldn't like you to have a green car, and they certainly wouldn't like to wear green at their wedding. And if you ask them why, they say, well, green is for grief. But then if you press it a little bit, they tell you that green is the colour of the graveyard, and green is also associated with the fairies. So there were lucky times to get married, and there were a lucky colour and unlucky colours to wear when you were getting married.
The newly married couple would attend Mass at Cockhill, where they would receive congratulations from all who knew them. This was another occasion for a big night. Small wonder then that weddings were looked upon as important events in the social calendar. Customs, beliefs, rituals and superstitions relating to death occupy a large place in the folk consciousness of Ireland, as would be the case with societies all over the world. This is inevitable, given that death would be perceived as a transition from one world to another, with its attendant elements of mystery and of the unknown. Thus, it would be vital to ensure that the soul of the deceased was given the optimum preparations for the afterlife, which would involve the various rituals associated with the mourning period between death and burial and the actual funeral. The wake and the funeral were the two main stages between death and burial, and bound up with each was a variety of beliefs and practices, in which the lines between religion and superstition often became blurred. A lot of customs and beliefs were common all over the country, but there would be also local variants. As the wake lasted from 1 to 3 days, it was a major occasion in a locality. And as we shall see, some of the activities at wakes were controversial over the centuries. Up to the latter decades of the 20th century, the body of the deceased would be kept in the home for 2 or even 3 nights prior to removal to the church or directly to the cemetery. This mourning period was known as the wake, a practice common in many countries. Because of the duration of the wake, it figured as quite an important occasion on the social landscape, and much material has been gathered on the various practices associated with wakes. In the definitive work on this subject, Irish Wake Amusements, translation of Chahavaimshire on Horev, the author Sean O'Sullivan describes a wide range of games and other amusements that attended wakes. These included storytelling, singing, dancing and games of various kinds. Some of these were harmless enough, while others that involved a practical joke element that sometimes developed into fights. At times over the centuries, the church became concerned at the riotous behaviour at these wakes, and O'Sullivan quotes numerous examples of edicts issued by diocesan authorities down through the years, condemning this behaviour and the excessive consumption of alcohol. The Synod of Armagh in 1614 declared that the pious feelings of devout people were outraged by the singing of lewd songs and the playing of obscene games by silly fellows. The Synod of Maynooth, 1875, ordered that parish priests must put an end to unchristian wakes where games, dances, singing and drinking are carried on. These abuses are a shame and a disgrace to the house of the dead. Here Pat O'Murchu and Pat Doherty from North Mayo speak on their recollections of wakes.
Vi den tårhund sin, maar door mij vi trie, gus trie lá tårhund. Gus baden ta mij ik dini, gus jen maar een jam kena vi voor je tårhund khali. Dan het sin gemadjen schaitje de begin of de kind. Daar brief kun je geworen. Gus maar door mij vi een kloffie show schule kom. Gerry het heen gaan al musketje, gus vi naar tåre ko gus pui kaltje gus tabak.
Tåre wat if tåre hinta. Gus We've tabak, we've vaderlijk gemaakt zijn een jaar of tabak. Ar flaten, we've lawn of flaten met tabak, gus pui kalt. Als je dat zijn. Gus wie pui palaya, hallo en koestel.
Pampel.
Vi kaltikas pakaltila tabaka halavan stimar. En sen de meshasen as fasen och mai. A fitcha den warsan där a khariat sa champal laki pipo en uwai la sawan la tabak. Sigentama. Fitcha drai his cha. Sen senetri hola niran. Iran hancher dor ke cha pobol. Iran cha pobol han said.
Ja, nu was.
I just why he said cha ador. Cuz kar hier tri ho gon niet. Ga cha den om para good gol no. Iran hairs. Kar van raka. Kart bij beter. Ga hier om precies na champol. Jo, ja, te vi.
I tegus här då.
Ses Bolini. Tes. Vi. Vet du ni hela men vet du. Det regular forskina fiam. Ja. Jag fick arte. Vi. Artegus. Ni har en karpensen en sekund och det en wagen vi här har.
Here we have an extract on the subject of wakes from the collection of folklore gathered by school children in the 1930s. In Tramore in olden days, wakes were a lot different to what they are today. They were remarkable for gaiety, which held sway during the 3 days. The first part of the fun at the wake would begin by drinking to the dead person, a wish that he was happy in their new life. Afterwards, everybody would fill up, whilst the beer and snuff would last. At about 12 o'clock at night, all the widows and old women of the parish would come to the kitchen and start what is called Cén Seacáning, to listen to those women singing such a mournful chant, is said to make the hearer remember it to their dying day. This chanting would be kept up for 12 hours, and it was done without light except for the candles around the corpse.
Na de chahi dine ní áhuí go bhar a chuirp na go man corp sioccaí, trí huair a chloig. Bheith duine na bertsput na háin sin a bheith leachaí mach a chuún corpus cin chláir. Chahi siad mas fear a bhí an chaid siad an féid le hí na bhéidir chuir cin chláir agus marrá leachaí mach le hí na marrá chuir cin chláir. Bhí se chaid siad an corp a bharú, fear a bhí fear a níos a go bhaint chós, chaid siad chuid édí abid ná chuid édí eile chuid éad habid an uair an smúchaid se gan na daoine. Ní a coltrachaí gléistí bid agur an na daoine mar tá nniu.
Food and drink would be acquired for all those who visited the house. The drink would be mainly whiskey or perhaps poaching.
They seem to be more at home with deaths than marriages or births. They loved wakes, they almost look forward to a timely death. If you say a timely death, it was time for him to go. It wasn't well time for him to go, and they themselves, in a way, look forward to death. And sometimes they found it hard to die. I know one man, and he was trying to die for a long time, and himself and the wife were living together. And the story goes that the neighbours he wasn't in good form, and the neighbours were in, one talking to the wife down. He was up in the room, and he shouted down then, Maggie, he said, will you bring up the blessed candles? I think I'll have another go at it. So this was kind of like a go at dying. So when they did die then, eventually died, especially if it was an older person that they were expecting to die. Well, they waited round respectfully for about half hour. Everything was quiet, nothing stirred, just said nothing. And then they said, kind of gave him a gentle hint that it was time for his spirit to go. So what they would do is they'd open the door and they'd close the curtains. They'd turn the clock, they'd stop the clock, and they'd turn the mirror to the wall, for fear on his way out anything would distract him and he'd want to wait. So then they had the wake, and of course the wake became rather a righteous thing, and in some cases it had to be stopped because there was all sorts of games and all sorts of shenanigans going on at the wake. But there would be snuff at the wake. The snuff was the big thing, and snuff pipes, and they wouldn't be adverse to putting a drop of snuff, a bit of snuff up the corpse's nose and all that. And all sorts of games were played at the wake, sometimes the corpse would be found in rigor mortis, you see, and in the coffin then he'd have to be kind of tied down, and some boy would just get the rope and cut the rope, you see, and he'd swing up like that, and of course they'd be flying out every place like that. There'd be a lot of drink too, and there'd be a lot of games. Some of the games now wouldn't be the best of games, but shall we say then, when the time came then for him to be brought to the graveyard, because it was only about the beginning of the 19th century, 20th century, that's 1900s, that it began to bring the corpse to the church, and that was mainly to offset a lot of the things that used to happen at wakes.
They shake the roof with their female crying and lamentation. The Spaniard recently reported that he remembers women keening from his childhood in the Tarragona area of Spain, which meant that the practice had survived there up to at least the 1970s. In Ireland, the keening or lamenting was usually done by women hired for the occasion, who would be given food and drink and possibly money.
Ach, when tú fos bist logi banchla, grahin torhis, grahin. Shawan anchi mi chedi gimmert na gluffi. We've gluffi ko boerach, agus kere wal in the moon, agus araga jorgen upper show. We ched the queen u gemai. We've queen u besora de ko ganne heli. Bhíh mar áchaín si tíochsteachan sin a chuoinú bhain warhhaí. Go minic is sealgear a bhid ó chiíach corp bhí a chuoinú. Nus deidir mé héanú na a chuoinú se deidir mé gáthórthúá agus níag sem a chrí go brach. Beicead an go ben an bhaon rud bhuachte agus bú wefelt agus bú waigní a deidir mé ríú. Deidir mé marrá cuint. Bert neidirúr hangrá. Bhí sé a chuoinú fear a bhís cin chláir agus fear a bhí ar a thórthú chéanúin. Ach bhí má gasú beg ag an ná agus tá cúna go bracha go main muúr.
After the wake of 1 or 2 nights, the deceased would be removed from the house and brought either directly to the cemetery or to the church. Father Fahey of Ballintubber, County Mayo, claims in his interview that bringing the deceased to the church only became commonplace from the 20th century, and that this practice was introduced as a measure to combat the rather dubious goings-on at wakes. In other words, it was a means of shortening the wake. This is borne out by an article from the Irish Times of 1908. In cases where the deceased was brought to the church after the funeral service, the coffin would be carried out of the church and then from there to the cemetery, much as is done today. However, there are accounts from County Limerick of coffins being carried from the church to the cemetery, even over long distances. In such cases, a relay of carriers would be engaged. Shouldering the coffin was a mark of esteem, even where the body had to be brought from a distance. The 4 bearers moved with a quick marching pace. Carrying the coffin over a large distance was thirsty work, and they shouldered the coffin to the chapel at that time. They shouldered a man from here to Drumkeen on one of the warmest days ever to come in the month of June. My father told me.
Agus an bar tíir chalisteal sa teampla. Íon hún gan faraidir an córa, jachtad Frankis, jaarachad ar stá, na lagana caidir le chéile. Íon a tean chóntra hain. Chaitin íon chadi péir an ádín chuim a chasí, péir déide. Jumfratin níle an ná faráíine le ná fargadín teamfalhaid an Nilana Hawaii. Hat er sich ja garach, schlag nin Chanel.